Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of Daily Kos The Brief. It's our weekly show about politics. I'm Marcos Molitzis. I'm here with co-host Carrie Eleveld, and today we have a co-host with Lauren Floyd. She's a staff writer at Daily Kos, focused on justice issues. Yes. Last week during our show, hi, thanks, Lauren, for joining us. Lauren will be with us the entire show. Really excited about that. Last week during our show, literally as the show was filming, we had the Derek Chauvin verdict come down, and we were already in the middle of a different show. We didn't expect a verdict that quickly. Turned out that it was a good verdict, so nobody's complaining. But we promised that we would be able to talk about the aftermath of that trial and the trial itself in the following week, which is today. So that's what we're going to be focused on. We have already Lauren Floyd, staff writer at Daily Kos, and joining us in a little bit will be Maurice Mitchell. He is the national director of the Working Families Party and also a key member of the Movement for Black Lives. So really excited to have this very important conversation. And so welcome, Carrie, Lauren. Thanks for being here, of course. And Lauren, you were covering the blow-by-blow of the Chauvin trial. And obviously we know how it ended, but can you talk a little bit about how you felt going into that coverage when the trial was about to start?
Sure. I was a little, I guess my feeling was nervousness, even starting the trial, because I wasn't exactly sure how it would go. And I was not pleasantly surprised, but I thought the prosecution did a really good job in communicating to the jury that, what you saw is accurate. You can believe your eyes, and providing context to what we saw, and providing, 45 witnesses took the stand, the majority of them for the prosecution. And so the prosecution really did a good job of going step by step, expert by expert, getting different police opinions, getting the chief of police opinion, and really forcing it down the jury's throats that, this was outside of policy, which was something that I hadn't really seen. It's rare to see cops come out and speak against other cops. And so when I saw that begin to unfold time and time again, witness after witness, that's when I began to get hopeful.
Was there a moment in the trial where you realized this is it? Like the prosecution nailed it. There's no way aside from the history of the just country, this is the moment where the prosecution sealed the deal. What was that moment, do you think?
There was no one moment, because it was the collective. It was the police chief. It was outside use of force experts. It was first responders, the firefighter who broke down on the stand crying when she started talking about the frustration of having to watch someone killed in front of you and not being able to do something, specifically as a first responder who is trained and could have helped in that situation. So it was let me try to think a single moment. No, but it was just witness after witness, and seeing it time and time again. But I was still nervous because I didn't know how it was going to go. Like, I was not confident at all when we were waiting for the verdict to come in. I still didn't know how it was going to go. I was hopeful in that the jury's interpretation was my interpretation of what I just saw, but I still couldn't be sure.
One of the things that came across so clearly, and I didn't get to watch all of the trial, so I took in a lot of it through headlines after the fact, reading your stories, seeing some of the coverage on TV. But the community traumatization of that killing, of people watching it, witnessing it, and not being able to do anything about it just seemed to come across so clearly in a way that I wasn't aware of before the trial. I do wonder for you, and this may not be a fair question. So if you don't want to get into it, feel free to do what most politicians do and just go somewhere else. But I do wonder what the personal toll of what for you was of covering this trial. I mean, there was, like I said, there was a lot of traumatization while the trial was happening. And I wonder if you could talk about your personal experience.
Yeah, watching some of those videos was difficult. I had to mute the sound from time to time because you're seeing someone die, you're seeing someone scared for their life over and over again from different angles, different clips of footage, different types of footage. And so, that is traumatizing. And so, if I need to mute the sound, I'll mute the sound. But trying not to as much as possible because, you want to see what's happening and you want to be able to report on what's happening. And so, yes, it's difficult, and it should be difficult. I think that's an important part that comes out of covering this trial and other cases like this, is that fighting the impulse to look away is important. And so, for a person of color, maybe not as important because this has been your whole life. You've been seeing this your whole life. But for other people who were shocked by this happening, who didn't think or, didn't really understand that this was a real problem, police brutality and racial profiling, they didn't really understand that this was a present day problem. I would encourage those people to not look away and to force yourself to get through that hard video, because we need to start feeling as a people, and we need to start looking at other humans as humans, despite what they might have done or said, or, however someone else's interpretation of them is. It's important to see with your eyes and to feel with your heart, because that's how I believe we're going to get to change.
Yeah, well, it was hard for me, and I'll admit I still haven't seen the full length video. I can't get through it. It just, and I'm amazed that you did, and multiple times, because they had all the different angles and everything. And to me, one of the most sort of searing moments of the trial, and I didn't watch it minute by minute like you did, but watching the coverage after, was when the coroner said that's the moment he died. And Chauvin sat there on his knee for an extra 6-7 minutes or whatever it was after that moment, and they're going to claim it was car exhaust or all the nonsense. But it was the other sort of piece that really stood out to me is that the defense was comically bad, and the prosecution was incredibly effective. And yet we all sat there and said, well, I hope he's convicted. I mean,
right.
It should never have been in doubt. And
right.
So that doubt and the fact that nobody really trusted the system, I actually think is more of an indictment of what happened. And if you look at the aggregate of police brutality in this country, or police killings, which is a subset of police brutality, obviously, police killings, and you see that 99% of them aren't even prosecuted, and not all of them are unjustified. But I would venture to say that a significant number of those are unjustified, just because we have a history of that. Every time we see video, it seems that most of the time we realize it wasn't justified. That this is an anomaly, and this almost proves just how messed up the system is, because you needed a case this clear cut, this obvious, and even then we had doubts that justice would be served, in that Chauvin would be punished for that murder. And so, I mean, coming out of it, did you actually? I didn't feel relief, but it's also, my community's trauma is different, right? I'm an immigrant. I'm Salvadoran. So I feel the children in cages on the border, right? That's my visceral, pain when I look at the news. For you, how did you feel after that verdict?
I was emotional. It felt like it was a weird feeling of thank goodness, and like this had to be guilty, right? This is one of those verdicts where it had to be guilty, because if it was not guilty, like how do we live in this society? You get it? Like, how do we function as a society that says it's okay to kneel on someone's neck for more than 9 minutes? This was one that had to be guilty. And then, like I said, when I was watching, I was anxious and I was nervous. And so it was like a yes moment and a we can breathe moment. It was like a, whew, okay, like a just a sense of relief. And then you were very quickly snapped right back out of it, because then we learned of Dante Wright's death.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next day happens, and I'm right back on the beat, right? I'm right back on covering police brutality, and it's a new story every day. It is literally a new story every day, and sometimes multiple stories a day.
Do you think that Black Lives Matter activists feel like this was a moment to sort of reboot, to restart, to potentially start to move in a slightly different direction? Because we've just been on this trajectory where it just gets worse and worse. It just never ends. I mean, at least there was some accountability here. And I know, like President Biden got in front of the camera and said, this could be a moment for change. I can't remember exactly how he said it, but he looked directly into the camera, and it was the last thing he said directly into the camera during an address right after the verdict came down. I wonder if that's felt by Black Lives Matter activists or not really.
I don't know, but I will say I don't put the onus on the activists at this point. At this point, the activists have done everything that they can do, like leading a movement and taking to the streets and marching and pressuring legislators. Like, it's in the hands of legislators. It's in the hands of police departments. It's in the hands of the president, the Biden administration, to hold people accountable and to say this is not okay and to investigate. And I've seen him do that so far. I've seen him step up and deliver in a way that I wasn't expecting.
Can you talk more about that? Can you talk about specifics of Biden stepping up some of what you've seen?
Yes, and part of it is me giving Biden credit for Merrick Garland decisions to investigate, but the decision to investigate the Minnesota police department, Minneapolis police department, and also let me think. What are some more examples of how Biden?
There was just another shooting incident in North Carolina. A shooting. I shouldn't say. I am kicking myself for calling it an incident. There was another shooting in North Carolina, and the Justice Department is already investigating that
on it.
Right. So that is an example of what you're talking about. The sort of swift action rather than let's sit back and give the benefit of the doubt and see, if this turns out different from every other case. Somehow this is different from every other case. It never is. But anyway, that's one more example. Just going down the line.
Yeah. Let's see. What else has Biden done? I write about this every week, and I can't think of anything he's done off the top of my head. But I will say this. It's also about who he's putting in positions to act, and the people he's appointing, the people he's nominating, and let me think. Also, he has a lot of elements built into his coronavirus relief package. He has a lot of different elements built into his Jobs Act that will just be so beneficial to the Black community overall, moving outside of the conversation of just criminal justice and policing reform, which are very essential conversations. But a lot of what President Biden is doing is pushing us past those conversations and getting us toward, upward mobility of Black and brown communities and specifically allocating dollars to that, and specifically making it a part of his jobs plan that he is going to prioritize areas that have been overlooked and areas that have been targeted, racially targeted, by some of these transportation projects, and cut off from desirable areas of the cities. And so that's one of the things that I found very hopeful, that I've been able to be hopeful about in some of the things that the Biden administration has already gotten on top of.
That's great.
Yeah.
You know, looking forward, do you have a burning question, Marcos? I don't want to interrupt you.
No, I don't have a burning question.
Okay.
So.
Well, I just wanted to, so, you know, we have the potential for more convictions, for more trial on this particular George Floyd case, right? On the murder of George Floyd, because there's still three, I feel like I'm frozen.
Yeah.
Right, can you guys hear me? Yeah. There's still three officers that that face potential trial, potential conviction. I just was listening to NPR today, and for the very first time, heard that two of those officers were on the job. It was their first week on the job, which was total news to me. That supposedly Chauvin was their trainer. I mean, of all things, he was supposed to be training them. But anyway, I wonder, is there any sense among activists about how likely getting more convictions is?
I'm sorry, hold on.
So actually, we'll take this as an opportunity. We have our guest, Maurice Mitchell, has joined us. So we can bring him on right now and actually have him join this conversation. So Maurice Mitchell is the national director of the Working Families Party. He's also a longtime member, now in a long time, but kind of a founding member of the Movement for Black Lives. He's been in this fight since Ferguson. And Maurice, thank you so much for joining us. Maurice, you're still muted.
Thanks for having me. There.
Yep.
All right, there you go. Good to be.
Maurice, tell us, before we start talking about these sort of weighty issues, let's give our listeners and viewers sort of an idea of who you are, and can you tell us your superhero origin story? Because I've known you for about 4 or 5 years, and I'm always so incredibly impressed by everything you do. So how about we share a little bit of that with our listeners?
Sure. Well, I'm an organizer. I've been organizing for most of my life, and I started youth organizing in New York, and in the late 90s, when I went to school, I went to Howard University, where one of our classmates was killed by the police. And that politicized a lot of us. And I threw myself into organizing around police violence, around the criminal legal system. And I eventually took that into a lifetime of organizing, mainly in New York. When Michael Brown was murdered in St. Louis, there's a long story, but the short story is I reached out to the Organization for Black Struggle and embedded with them. I ended up leaving my job, my family, my friends in New York. And, maybe 2 weeks or a week and a half after Michael Brown was killed, embedded with the Organization for Black Struggle in St. Louis in order to support the folks on the ground. And I was just so inspired by what I saw. What I tell folks is that, Ferguson, the people of Ferguson changed the world. And the young people, young working class Black folks, sometimes leaving their service industry jobs, hit the protest lines and totally transformed how we look at policing, race, anti-Black racism. And I was one of the people who was inspired by the people of Ferguson. And I changed my life. I transformed my life to go there and be in service to them. And eventually through that work became the DNA, the work that I and many, many other people, folks on the ground in St. Louis, as well as folks around the country, that work became the DNA of the Movement for Black Lives. And then I went on to help catalyze the Movement for Black Lives to become an international movement. And when Donald Trump rode this white Christian identity wave all the way up to the White House, I felt duty bound to figure out how I could help organize to stop him. And that brought me to the Working Families Party, where now I try to create a multiracial working class alignment of forces to form an electoral united front and to build a solidarity that is a multiracial solidarity to challenge the solidarity of whiteness, right? A lot of times people think of white supremacy and white nationalism as a hate movement, and that's half white. That's half white, right? Right? It's definitely catalyzed by hate, but that hate is a source of solidarity, the solidarity of whiteness, which I would argue has been a leading driving force in American politics from the very beginning. And if we want to challenge that and create a more democratic society, one where Black people in our communities feel safe, and one where in any democratic society, the police and the military are under the democratic control of the people, if that we want to make that true in Black communities, then we need to build a multiracial solidarity that is stronger than the solidarity of whiteness. And so that's the work that I've been doing since August of 2018 with the Working Families Party, building a broad national movement that's very bottom up, that gets everyday people elected, like folks like Jamal Bowman, who won a contested election against an incumbent, and did so during the height of the movement, and proudly said that he agreed with the ideas that we should be defunding the police and investing in our communities. And it's the work that I do till today.
That's actually a perfect jumping off point, because let's just get into, I'm a huge believer. You're talking about the power of activism, the power of grassroots activism. I'm a huge believer in it. But there's also this tension, right, with party politics. Right. And at the Working Families Party, you guys are sort of right in the middle of that tension, right? And following the 2020 elections, where there were a bunch of Democrats in these sort of swingy districts who nearly lost their seats, they complained pretty bitterly about the slogan, defund the police. And my response to that is, politicians don't get to set what activists do or say, but they don't get to set the agenda. But I wonder, from your perspective, where you sit, how you feel about that tension, how you're working with, between to sort of translate between what's happening between the activists and the party, or not. Whatever your take is.
Well, that's a great question, and I would answer it in a number of ways. Number one, in a movement ecosystem, we need to appreciate people's different lanes, right? So what might be appropriate for a direct action organizer and activist may or may not be appropriate for a candidate that's attempting to get 50% plus one of the vote, right? So I wouldn't argue for any candidate to knock on the door of a resident or a citizen and knock on the door, and the first thing they say is hashtag defund the police, right? Right? I would not say that would be the best strategy to build a relationship with whoever's behind that door. Now, that in no way means that the Movement for Black Lives, by all measures, has not done its job. The largest social movement in US history. More than 26 million people hit the streets. And if it wasn't for the sharp focus of the defund movement, a lot of these conversations that we're having right now about the appropriateness of the language, or we wouldn't be having those conversations. So social movements, when they're the most successful, they make visible the invisible, and they make possible the impossible, right? And so what does that mean? Social movements often surface contradictions and problems in our society that we've grown accustomed to, or we've grown blind to. And they often do it in ways that are piercing and intense and often uncomfortable to people. Many times social movements are statistically, quote unquote, unpopular. Like people right now, like you could go to McDonald's during MLK Day and you'll see his picture on the wall. When he died, he was unpopular, right? So the interventions of social movements must not necessarily be popular in the ways that other ideas have to be popular. Also, new ideas, by definition, are not popular, and they have to grow in popularity, right? So I would say that, like, the Movement for Black Lives is doing its job by creating that tension. Now, politicians have a different ministry, if you will, right? And every Democrat who is running for office, from the most progressive to the most sort of centrist Democrat, understands that they will have the same reliable far-right talking points lobbed at them. It is their role and their duty to figure out, in the context of their district, and every district is different, how they communicate who they are in this environment where the far right is always going to say that every single Democrat is basically a Trojan horse for the Marxist socialist sort of agenda, or that every single Democrat is against quote unquote law and order. We know that these attacks will happen and that they're reliable. The particular proof points or the particular news stories that they'll use in order to give their talking points credibility will change. So today it's defund the police. Tomorrow it'll be something else. What elected Democrats need to do in every single one of their districts is figure out what their electoral strategy needs to be on the ground. And I think it's actually disappointing that Democrats, instead of having a sober sort of post-mortem where they looked at each district, each loss, each win, and examined where they were strong, what made them strong, and where they were weak, what made them weak, sort of used the movement as essentially a catch-all for all of their problems. I thought that was disappointing, and it doesn't bode well for Democrat strategy in future elections. And 2022 is right around the corner. And as you know, midterm elections are vexing for the party in power. I would tell Democrats, instead of like blaming the movement for Black Lives for being extraordinarily successful by all measures of what a social movement should be, that Democrats should learn. And I would say take it district by district. What you would learn is that in each district, there's a unique set of circumstances, the candidate, their appeal, the amount of money they raise, the strategies, the tactics that they use that could help explain what allowed them to win or lose. The last thing I'll say is that oftentimes when it relates to electoral wins and loses, we fall into the survivorship fallacy, where we look at a win and then we imagine, looking backwards, that every single thing that person did that led to that win had to be a mark of their genius. And we look at a loss and imagine that every single thing that person did that led to that loss was somehow a mark of their foolishness or their idiocy, right? When we know, and we know this in our personal lives, sometimes you stumble into a win, or sometimes you do every single thing right and ultimately lose, right? So we need to have a little bit more nuance and sophistication if we want to get better. So if Democrats are really interested in getting better and sharper, they should have that conversation. And I will concede that in some audiences, defund the police is a triggering sort of phrase. I will concede that. That still doesn't explain Democrat losses and wins, and I hope that they take that seriously.
100% agree.
I'm always struck by how practical you are, Maurice. Given that a lot of our colleagues in not just in Black Lives Movement, but just in general progressivism can fail to see that big picture. And so I've always been hyper practical, and I know you are as well. And it's a mark of doing what's possible, and getting somebody like Jamal Bowman elected was a mark of what's possible, right? And our producer Walter put up a quote from one of the debates, and the quote is, "Yes, I support the defunding of the police. If we reinvest in jobs, that there won't be a need for as large a police force as we have, and there won't be a need for the militarization of the police. The whole country is rising up because we're tired of waiting." And that is eminently sensible, right? And of course, the right wing's going to take that and say they want to get rid of the police, they want to eliminate the police. Yeah, I just read a story about the Newark police, New York, New Jersey, where not a single shot was fired in 2020.
Wow.
And it can be done. And a lot of that was reinvesting in community groups that are working on preventing that violence, lowering tension in gang-related areas, that sort of thing. And it works if you put the money in and the effort, and you don't walk around with guns pulled. So yet you look at we talked before you came on, Maurice, we talked with Lauren about the Chauvin trial, and during the trial, there was police shootings, and after the trial, there were police shootings, and they're wearing body cams, and they're being taped by people, and they still don't seem to care or realize that maybe sentiment is turning. And in fact, they almost seem aggrieved, like they are under siege, and it's so unfair that they're under siege. So if the one instance, rare instance of actual a policeman being held accountable, in large part because his police chief said, no, that's not cool. And that's, how rare that is.
That's right.
What's that next step? What's the next step to impose that accountability and that change in police forces around the country?
That's a great question. And I would say that, generally accountability feels like oppression to the privileged, right? And so
they hate it.
Yeah. The fact that they're going from complete impunity to some modicum of accountability feels like the worst violence you could possibly imagine, right? And that just shows how far we need to go in shifting our culture and how hard it's going to be. So what I will say about the outcome of the Chauvin trial is, number one, think about what it took. It took the largest social movement in our history. It took uninterrupted and graphic video. It took dozens of eyewitnesses. It took a number of police breaking that thin blue line. It took all of those things in concert to lead to this one conviction, right?
An obvious one.
Yeah, one of the most obvious, and it took all of that. So that lets you know what we're up against. In terms of going further, there's a number of things that we need to do. So some folks in the audience may know this. I'm sure you all know this because you're close observers of politics, but policing actually happens on the local level. So when you talk about the police, you're talking about tens of thousands of jurisdictions, and we need to do two things. Right now in the federal government, they're talking about moving the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, the Movement for Black Lives, and introduced through Ayanna Pressley and Rashida Tlaib, the Breathe Act, which talks about, like you said, those investments in the programs that are outside of the police, but have been proven consistently to actually improve safety and decrease harm and decrease violence in our communities. So making those federal investments so they trickle down to the ground, and as it relates to the on the local level, holding local elected officials, mayors, DAs, city councils accountable to this idea. And I could give an example. The one example I'll give is marriage equality. There was a point relatively recently, within not too long, within our lived experience, where when we thought about marriage equality, we were like, yes, this is a justice issue, and I can't imagine this culture embracing this. This might take a decade. This might take 2 decades. This might take a generation of culture change. We live in a culture that is woven into it this sort of Christian identity and this Puritanism, and then it went from not possible to inevitable, right? And I think if we think about the work that we need to do on the local level in that way, we need to have big fights around reducing the size, scale, and scope of the police and investing in our communities. And we need to make sure that happens in enough localities where it goes from this sort of topic of conversation to the maybe one day to it's inevitable. It's only a matter of time. And I think the work that's happening on the federal level, we need to, hold the Biden administration and everybody in Congress accountable to making that happen. And then on the local level, in city by city, locality by locality, we need to hold local politicians accountable. That's one of the things that we've been doing at the Working Families Party in partnership with the Movement for Black Lives. We have the WFP Justice Fund. And what we've said is that with that fund, we will release those resources to local elected officials that choose not to take law enforcement resources and choose to commit to investing in communities and narrowing the size, scope, and scale of police. Because what we recognize is that on the local level, and this is true on the national level, is that police unions play a critical role in slowing down and stopping any motion. So even as our culture is shifting, police unions are using their resources, are using carrots and sticks, and using fear tactics in order to hold elected officials, both Democrats and Republicans, hostage. And we need to break that up. So that's the work that we think needs to happen in order to secure and lock in some of these cultural gains in real policy.
So let me bring. Sorry, I know, Carrie. marriage equality came up, I know you're like, that's your baby, right? But I actually want to bring in Lauren in really quickly because she's been covering the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And I just like to give her an opportunity to tell us what exactly that is and what it would do, basically.
Sure. So what the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act would do is really create a national standard for how police departments should be operating. And it would also, it's a huge legislative push. And so it would do that. It would do a number of other things. It would also ban chokeholds, and it would ban no-knock warrants, which, hugely criticized in the death of Breonna Taylor. And so that's what I think is a critical piece missing from the puzzle, is how should police departments be acting, and how do we get them to change, and what does that look like on a federal level? Because like you just brought up, police departments are local. Each police department is in each city functions differently, and it's kind of subject to the culture of that police department. And so I think that it is crucial to have federal legislation that gets at, okay, you can do what you want to an extent, but these are the rules that you must play by. And there's setting a certain minimal precedence of how you behave, I think is absolutely needed.
Yeah, I would go further as it relates to the federal government, right? So it's true, policing is on the local level, but the federal government is one of the major funders of local police through various federal grants. So the federal government has carrots, and those carrots can be translated into accountability. The DOJ, so Barack Obama's DOJ started to use certain tools like dissent decrees in order to hold local police departments accountable. As we know, during the Trump years, he completely reversed that. He didn't just reverse it. He actually gave license, like famously, for police to commit human rights abuses against American citizens and to brutalize American citizens. Brutalize American citizens as they got arrested. And as we know, simply getting arrested doesn't say anything about whether or not you're guilty or not guilty of any crime, right? So, just the horror of the fact that we had a president that was doing that. So what we've seen is that with Merrick Garland recently, with how he responded to the Minneapolis Police Department, the fact that they're going to investigate the police department signals that the Biden administration is reversing that, going back to Obama era. What I would caution, though, is that simply going back to Obama era is filling the gap that was left behind by Trump, right? And the Biden administration has to do two jobs, has to fill all those gaps, right? And then has to go even further, right? And I think a full government approach to that is essential. So the legislation, like you talked about, and I would put a plug in for the Breathe Act, which does the investment, right? The investment into violence interruption and other community-based solutions. The DOJ playing its role, holding police departments accountable. The president using the bully pulpit, consistently articulating, yes, believe your eyes and ears. Structural racism does exist, and we have to focus on it like a laser. All of those things I think are going to be necessary, as well as what can only happen on the local level.
Can I just jump in? I want to piggyback off of something you said, because it's really interesting, this comparison between the Black Lives Matter movement and what you talked about with marriage equality. And of course, there's a larger LGBTQ equality movement. But one of the things you were talking about earlier is you're trying to build a multiracial racial justice movement, right? And how important that is, right? That it's not just Black folks, but it's white folks, it's Black folks, it's brown folks, et cetera. And I think one of the reasons for the relative success of the marriage equality movement that is underappreciated by a lot of people was just that LGBTQ people exist in every corner, every facet of American life. So it doesn't matter whether you're Christian or Muslim, or it doesn't matter whether you're white, brown, Black, et cetera. Like, it doesn't matter your gender. It doesn't even matter party lines. There's Republicans who are gay. So one of the things that made that start to become inevitable was this cross section of people who wanted it, even though it was a relatively small group of people when you think about the massive Black Lives Matter movement, right? It was the cross section that mattered. Let me just ask you too. You know, you've brought up New York Congressman Jamal Bowman several times. We're getting ready to have a congressional address from President Biden, and Congressman Bowman is going to deliver a response to that address, right? Normally we get a Republican response to that address, which will happen. God only knows what that's going to be like. But what do you expect to hear from Congressman Bowman? Because you guys help facilitate that response. What do you expect to hear that we won't hear from President Biden?
Well, the way that I like to look at this is in two ways. Number one of the things that we said after 4 years of Trump and all of this like activity coming from the ground up, we understood that we wanted to learn the lesson from 2009. Famously, Barack Obama built an electoral movement in 2008, and then that electoral movement demobilized, right? And then by the August recess, you had a far-right movement in the Tea Party that has shifted and shaped the politics to this day, right? So we wanted to make sure that people understood that electing Joe Biden was the door, not the destination. The destination still required people to stay engaged. That part of the governing sort of a coalition included the people, not just elected officials. And we needed people in the grassroots to stay active to ensure that the stated goals of the Biden administration, the Biden administration has stated that they want to build back better, that they want to focus on racial justice, on climate change, on ensuring that every American that wants a job can have a job through full employment, right? These are the things that they stated. Those are transformative goals. That is in some way Biden stepping into an FDR type sort of legacy, right? And if that's what he wants to do, then he's going to need the grassroots to be highlighting it and moving the North Star as far as possible. And I think what Jamal Bowman is going to talk about is going to be additive and complementary, and speak positively to all the things that we've done, and also inspire the grassroots to stay engaged, because Joe Biden will not succeed in any of the things that he stated if the grassroots are demobilized. And I think that Jamal is going to be focusing on that. The second thing is, one thing that I think is really amazing about Jamal's victory and what Jamal represents is that he represents a very diverse district. Half of his a big piece of his district is in Westchester. A big piece of his district is in the Bronx. He grew up in the Bronx. He was an educator in the Bronx until he left to go to DC. And his district represents that multiracial working class alignment. It represents people in the suburbs. It represents people in urban areas. And Jamal is, to me, speaking directly to the heart of what people are experiencing on the ground, that urgency, that intensity. And I think that intensity will I think, complement whatever we hear from the White House and President Biden. And I think that it speaks to this complementary sort of co-governance that we're going to need in order to break through a lot of the challenges and really make sure that this Congress gets voting rights passed. And we know that the filibuster is going to be a huge barrier. We have this razor thin majority in the Senate, and it's going to require all of us to break through some of that. And we can't just be spectators as folks in the audience. We need to be agents of the change. And I think that is one of the reasons some people have asked us, like, we've done this response during the Trump years. Why are we doing a response during the Biden years when we endorsed Joe Biden? And the reason is we are taking our place, our rightful place as folks outside in the grassroots in order to create the conditions for the Biden administration to be transformative. And it's this famous Rooseveltian sort of, it might even be an apocryphal sort of story about how labor activists laid down an agenda. And he said, I agree with you, now make me do it. Well, that make me do it part is our job. And so I think Jamal is going to be speaking a lot about that.
So, Maurice, I know we're almost out of time with you. So let me ask you, I think one more question. So I'm haunted by 2009, right? Because we all saw it coming. It was so obvious it was happening. The Obama team didn't seem to care or didn't see it coming. I'm not sure what happened. But because of 2010, Donald Trump happened. The voter suppression in places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. Florida, and so on, they happen because that 2010 Republican wave elected these supermajorities in those state legislatures. And we still have not recovered to this day. We're facing trouble in redistricting because of those 2010 Republican victories. So our inability to turn out our people really hurt us, in concert with the rise of the Tea Party. Now, I know Carrie's been writing about this quite a bit, that Joe Biden, maybe because he's white and old, doesn't seem to be generating a movement the way the Tea Party rose against Obama, the way the Women's March rose against Donald Trump. So you're seeing this sort of like quiet complacency on the right base, or concern about Dr. Seuss and Mr. Potato Head, and that's fine with me. I keep worrying about dumb shit like that. The question is, though, are our people going to turn out? And as somebody, Maurice, who really is sort of, your job literally is to mobilize grassroots activists, how are you sensing right now the intensity of the progressive base to engage electorally next year? Because like you said, the Senate and the House are both going to be on the ballot.
Sure. Great question. We can take nothing for granted, right? Every single inch of space, we need to earn it. And we can't take any inch of space for granted. And so what do I mean by that? So right now, President Biden's polling numbers are pretty high. And the far right is kind of stabbing around in the dark and, stabbing into these culture war fights that aren't necessarily getting enough traction outside of their media environment, right? Mm-hmm. None of us should rely on any of those things, right? I think we've all witnessed how quickly our culture could shift, the narrative could shift. Eventually, as they stab around in the dark, they might actually hit something, right? And hit a current. The Tea Party didn't emerge initially. They had to kind of get their bearings. And trust me, the far right is looking for that cross-cutting set of issues that will animate their base in a way that they need to. And so I wouldn't put it past them to finally figure that out. Now, on our side, what we need to do is to ensure that Democrats govern like they won, right? They need to govern like they won, and the results of their governance needs to be direct and meaningful material relief to the American people, right? If we do that, for example, the $1.9 trillion COVID relief, all of that money went to state and local governments and directly into the pockets of American people. If the Biden administration could consistently do those things as it relates to the jobs plan and to the family plan, and build a record where people don't need to, you don't need to break out a graph, and you don't need to prove to anybody. They actually feel it in their lived experience, how life under Trump was one way and life under Biden and with progressives is a very significant and different way. Then you have everything you need in order to stave off what historically can be a bad cycle for the party in power. Now, if Democrats don't take that seriously, and if Democrats don't ensure that the rules are fair by passing S1, then it's lights out for the Democrats. And I actually think that Republicans understand that this next election could participate an electoral realignment that will be hard to break over the next decade, but in either direction. So if Democrats fail to ensure that the rules are fair and preempt a lot of these crazy far-right anti-democratic laws, somebody, a mentor of mine said that the Republicans have become the party of the dictatorship, and I couldn't agree with that more, right? If Democrats don't do that, and then on one hand, and then on the other hand, provide significant relief to the American people, then they will lose power. They will lose the Senate and possibly lose the House. And then, essentially, it leaves the president being feckless and unable to be able to advance the agenda, and creates the conditions where if the Republicans are maniacal enough, and they are, they will stymie any positive developments for the next 2 years, so they could create the political environment for a President Cotton or some other person who essentially has the same values of Donald Trump, but is less, less erratic, let's say, right? I was going to use a lot of other words, but I chose erratic. You could fill in the word. And
potentially more dangerous.
Yeah, it's much more dangerous. And in that environment, you could imagine a political realignment, because it'll be a non-virtuous cycle where that president continues the job that Donald Trump started in remaking the judiciary, the federal judiciary, so that when they pass these anti-democratic, completely unconstitutional laws, they'll have a judiciary that'll rubber stamp it if we ever bring it to litigation. And their rules changes will make it so that us, through democratic means, can never access governing power. And then we essentially will be living in a form of right-wing dictatorship. It's really frightening, but actually possible. And it starts today with the Democrats governing like they won and focusing those resources into the American people. And then also taking a page from the far right. When they're in power, they focus like a laser on maintaining power and advancing power. If Democrats could focus like a laser on making sure that everyday people have power through S1 and other legislation, then there'll be a path to stave off the far right taking governing control. But there needs to be an urgency, and that's one of the reasons why the grassroots are so essential, because there's something about being inside the Beltway where all the urgency gets muffled, and there's something about being inside a White House where it's self-referential, and if you're not interrupting these sort of circular conversations that happen there, you could kind of lose your way. And that's the job that people who are listening right now have to take seriously, of elevating the stakes, the urgency, and the need for Democrats to push the boundaries of what's possible.
So, Maurice, every election's the most important election in our lifetime, and it's probably going to be that way for a while. Thank you so much for joining us, Maurice. I love you. I love the work that you're doing. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you today.
Absolutely.
It's good to be here. Take care.
Lauren, in that theme about delivering to people, it's a very important one. And I know it's one that Carrie and I both had written about. You're actually doing a series on Joe Biden's delivering on promises to the Black community, which I think has extra salience because Joe Biden is president because of the Black community. Without the South Carolina Black vote, he doesn't win the nomination. And I've also said that it was probably the smartest move, because Carrie and I have talked about it. We were warning people, like, I don't know if anybody else beats Donald Trump, right? I think the Black community made a bet that they knew America better than people like me, and they were right and I was wrong. So I definitely want to keep reiterating that, because it's scary how close it was, given who Donald Trump was and who Joe Biden is. But the reality, the bottom line is, he's not president without the Black community, both in winning the nomination and obviously in winning the White House, and then in picking up the Senate, right? The Black community was integral in all of those. So you've been writing about him delivering on those promises. What grade would you give Joe Biden today, understanding that we're still at 100 days, right? There's a lot of presidency left.
Exactly. Right now, I give him a solid B, which is a great grade for me.
I bet you didn't expect that, because I don't think any of us expect that.
I expected a really moderate presidency without much change. I mean, he is hitting the ground running, and Maurice talked about executive order after executive order. I mean, the first 100 days has to be a lot about undoing what Trump did, right? So you see, like, I'm reading the executive orders every week, and you see just executive order after executive order, just getting at that. So once we can get past that, undoing what Trump did, I'm really hopeful about what we can accomplish with this administration in a way that I didn't anticipate. I mean, you can't help but be hopeful coming from Trump. It was like a real bottom.
I mean, you think I mean, it was a low bar to exceed, but I mean, he didn't exceed the low bar. Like, he went to that high jump and he like vaulted over it. And all of us are kind of sitting there going, wait, what?
What?
Easily, right. President Biden easily could have presided over a reversion to democratic norms, right? And I mean, big D, democratic norms, not small d. And instead, he's moved forward, right? He's not, it's not just a reversion to the norm. He's doing something much bigger than that. And I agree with you. I've been pretty impressed so far and hope he continues.
Yeah.
So one name that you mentioned him, and Maurice also mentioned him, and again, it's one of these surprising ones, is Merrick Garland, right? Because of all his nominees, he's the one where I think a lot of progressives were like, wait, what?
Right.
Like, really? That such an important position. And you're going to pick a guy who doesn't particularly have a strong record on even civil rights issues, much as some other things. He was the boring, middle of the road person that Barack Obama nominated for the Supreme Court, thinking he could win Republican support. Mm-hmm. That's why he was nominated, not because he was a big champion of liberal politics.
Because he could get him through. He was thinking.
But again, Maurice, yeah, exactly. That's good. Maurice, and then now you mentioned him several times. So are you pleased so far with what you're seeing from Merrick Garland?
I'm pleased so far. I want to see it continue. I'm really interested to see what happens in the aftermath of Derek Chauvin's conviction, right? When maybe a year or two from now, you don't see protests happening in the streets every day, when it's not right in your face in the news cycle every single day. And maybe it will be. That's on us as a people, whether we keep it in their faces. But I'm interested to see if he continues along this path and really starts investigating some of these police departments, because they're awful and they've been awful for decades.
And so significant number of them.
It's a culture. And that's one of the things I wish I had thought to talk about when Maurice was here is, how do you change the culture of policing, right? Because the conversation that we are having is about creating standards, holding them accountable, but how do you change this culture and this mindset and the arrogance? How do you get at that?
I was just listening to a Throughline podcast about the history of policing in the United States. And it's a really good one. I can't remember the exact name, and I recommend it to all. It's a good podcast in general. But they were just talking about how there have been these commission after commission looking at what happened in, certain situations and how racial profiling unfolded and blah, 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 blah. And like that same report gets written every 20, 25, 30 years over the course of the last century. And it gets brought to light. And then we just go back, and another 30 years later, it gets brought to light. And then we just go back about police brutality, et cetera. All these blue ribbon commissions, blah, hoity toity, blah, blah, blah. But nothing changes. And how bringing awareness to the situation isn't enough to change the situation. So I don't have an answer to your question, but I'm just thinking like, what a great question it is. Like, how do you change that culture? It's like you have to completely rip apart what has been a historical norm in policing and racial profiling for centuries.
Yeah, there was an article where you had a police chief basically implying that on a traffic stop, if the police didn't approach with their hand on their gun and a light into the car, it would mean dead cops. Even though traffic stop shootings of police are exceedingly rare, their idea is they basically say if you reform, you're killing cops, and that's the big part of that culture shift, is to get them away from this black and white and say, like whatever Newark did. In Newark, if you can do it in Newark, which has a heavy gang presence, if you can go an entire year, and by the way, there was a shot fired this year, so the record's broken, but they went the entire 2020 without a single gunshot being fired. If you can do it in Newark, you can do it pretty much anywhere, I think. So that's all we have for today. That's the end of our show. Thank you so much, Lauren, for joining us the entire time. It was a real pleasure to have you here. Thanks to Maurice Mitchell for joining us as well. Thanks to Walter Einenkel for producing the show. Thanks, Carrie, for co-hosting. And thank you for listening. If you're enjoying the show, be sure to subscribe and give us a rating wherever you get your podcasts. You can always talk to us at dailykos.com or on Twitter at Daily Kos. See you next week.